Good afternoon for us, good evening for those of you in the East Coast, and good morning to probably in Thailand. Welcome. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which in addition to me includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Welcome back, and many thanks to tonight's guest, David Frum, and also to our wonderful moderator, Larry Mantle. During these very trying and busy times, we are very grateful to hear your conversation and your thoughts and your opinions. Again, we want to thank our amazing audience for responding so generously to our requests for donations. You've ensured another year of our programming. And of course, if you haven't had a chance to donate, we're still accepting donations through the link that is in every email. But we're really grateful for your encouragement, your support, your notes. And we just feel very blessed with our audience. And I hope you feel the same way about us. Tonight is our 70th program of 2024. We will close out this very complicated and somewhat scary year with two final programs. One of them is this Sunday, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert in conversation with Nasser al-Kidwa, who is the former foreign minister of the Palestinian Authority. They will be speaking about two former leaders, an Israeli and a Palestinian, offer a path to peace with the wonderful Larry Mantle. In today's email you'll get right after the program, there's an article that they jointly, actually it's an editorial piece that they jointly published a couple of months ago that you might want to read as sort of a preparation for Sunday morning at 10 a.m. And then next Wednesday, as the final program for 2024, we have the New York Times Pulitzer Prize winning columnist Nicholas Kristof in conversation with Madeline Brand. It says Warren only in the program, but it's with Madeline, and it's finding about a very relevant topic for December 2024, finding hope in stressful times. So we hope you'll join us. Of course, we're going to be off for 2 weeks from December 18th until January 8th, a short break before January's program, which 2025 starts with Dr. Anthony Fauci. He has recently recovered from a life-threatening illness. He had West Nile virus. He was supposed to be with us a couple of months ago, but that was not possible. But he's feeling well and has lots to talk about. So we hope that you'll join us, and we will miss you, but not yet because we still have two more programs. Now, to introduce tonight's guest and to lead our discussion, please welcome the incomparable Larry Mantle, host of the longest running talk show probably ever, but certainly in Southern California. Air Talk on NPR's affiliate, LA List, is a great daily show, and most of us never miss it. Larry is not only beloved by our America Crossroads audience, but he is an icon in Southern California where he can be heard almost every weekday morning. Larry, the show is all yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janice and Zev and Mel. It's so good to be back with you for America at a Crossroads. I always appreciate this opportunity, and I'm looking forward tonight to talking with David Frum. He's a frequent guest on these programs. Though a Republican until recently, he's been one of the most outspoken conservative critics of the populist president-elect. David's first book 3 decades ago was a critique of his own party at the end of the 20th century. He went on to serve in George W. Bush's administration as a speechwriter, and in the decades since, he's written several books, including Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy, and Trumpocracy, The Corruption of the American Republic. He went on to write for the National Review and the Weekly Standard before settling in at the Atlantic as a senior editor a decade ago. He's also a frequent contributor to MSNBC. David, thank you for joining us. We appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Thank you. Glad to join you.
Let's start with the news of the day. FBI Director Christopher Wray told the members of the Bureau he plans to resign at the end of Joe Biden's term. President-elect Trump had already announced he's nominating Kash Patel for the job. During Wray's tenure, the Bureau investigated Trump on multiple charges, Hunter Biden in cases loaded with conspiracy and controversy and criticism and all kinds of speculation. David, you recently wrote in The Atlantic about what replacing Wray with Patel would mean for the country. It's titled A Constitutional Crisis Greater Than Watergate. How so?
That's not a turn of speech. What was Watergate? Why was Watergate a big deal? President Nixon his administration was implicated in the burglary of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate premises. It's not clear that Nixon ordered that. We still don't know exactly how it happened, but Nixon almost immediately went into cover-up mode. And the way he tried to cover it up was by using presidential authority to get the FBI and the CIA to tell the Justice Department to back off. There was a secret operation there. This was not about the president. This was not about the election. It would have been shameful to use the FBI in such a way. That's why he lied. And everyone understood that the use of the FBI for crass partisan political purposes was radically improper. Out of Watergate developed a new ethos where the FBI, unlike almost any other agency in government, unlike any other national security agency, was moved out of politics. New president comes to town, that president is entitled to choose his or her own CIA director, his or her own director of the National Security Agency. But they are not entitled to choose their own FBI director, or they were not. So Nixon's final choice as FBI director held the office into the Carter administration. Jimmy Carter's choice of FBI director held the job into the 7th year of the Reagan administration. And so it went, that the FBI and the president were not coterminous. Now, Donald Trump was the first person to try to change that when he fired James Comey. And that was such an uproar that he settled that matter by saying, okay, I want to put a stooge in, but I give up. I have fired Comey. And he picked Chris Wray, the present FBI director, as his person, which was already an innovation, but at least a person above criticism. Wray has held that job since 2017. And now Trump is saying, although I have no critique of Wray, he was inconvenient to me. He did things I didn't want. So now I'm asserting that the FBI director is coterminous with the president, and I'm firing him, or Wray has agreed to go, which is even worse, shameful on Wray's part. And I want to appoint this preposterous person. Now, I don't think Kash Patel will actually ultimately make it. But whether he does or not, the damage is done because we now have a new rule that the president is entitled to his own FBI director, which he was never before. This is new in American life, and it's dangerous.
So what are your concerns, David, about the ways in which a politicized FBI could operate?
Well, most crimes in the United States, of course, are handled by the states. But 90% of the people who are in prison are in state prisons. Law enforcement is primarily a state responsibility. The federal government and the FBI undertake certain very specialized and very serious crimes. To be in the target is a heavy matter. Simply to be the target of an FBI investigation, even if they never bring a charge against you, is already an onerous and expensive thing. If the FBI investigates you for 2 years and then at the end says, okay, our mistake, you're free to go, nothing to see here, you don't get your money back and you don't get your life back and you don't get the fear back. Now, most of the people investigated by an FBI, a properly run FBI, have come so close to the line that even if they're not charged, we don't care that they don't get their money back. You were taking some risks with your eyes open. Federal crimes are not easy to stumble into. This is not like shoplifting. These are, serious crimes of terrorism and kidnapping and crimes of
Public corruption.
public corruption. But to have an FBI director who answers to the president, whether an utter stooge like Kash Patel or a more necktie-wearing person, that's going to be a different thing in American life. And the whole history of the FBI since J. Edgar Hoover was forced out in the 1970s, since Richard Nixon failed to politicize the FBI during Watergate, has been to make sure the FBI never, ever does that. And that's Trump's top priority, to make the FBI an arm of presidential power.
So what do you say to those critics of Chris Wray and to the Bureau under his leadership who say it was used as a target against the president-elect? And Trump said, he searched my house and
By who?
took that personally. What do you say to that?
I would say, what do you mean it was used? It was used by whom? They would
I'm
say,
sorry.
so when you say, I'm now imagining, I'm not attributing this to you. We're going to have an imaginary conversation.
Yeah.
Trump says the FBI was used against me. And I say, David, used by whom? And Trump says, Biden. That's who used it. So, oh, Biden, whose own son was indicted, prosecuted, and convicted. He was the one who used the FBI against you. That, in fact, the Wray FBI demonstrated neither fear nor favor. It prosecuted, indicted, and convicted the son of the serving president. That's, by the way, the reason that Biden's pardon of his son is such an outrage, because we need, with people like Trump stalking the earth, we need to teach the American people what they all ought to know, which is these institutions are above politics. And the indictment of Hunter Biden is a powerful message about the integrity and impartiality of the law. And it's true, Hunter Biden was probably punished more heavily than the ordinary person in a situation. But of course, Hunter Biden was not the ordinary person. He was the son of the president. He has a special duty to keep clean, and he didn't do that. He did things he shouldn't do. He traded
Well,
on his name. So,
and
so when Trump says they're targeting me, well, they indicted President Biden's son. They also targeted him. So don't commit crimes is the message here. Do not commit crimes. Don't steal government documents, and they won't search your house.
so what was your response though when President Biden, as part of the pardon, said, well, no one else would have been prosecuted for this. No, way would weighty charges like this been filed against this case. That's essentially the defense that Trump's supporters made
No.
about the charges against Trump. Who else would be charged for taking documents? Who else would be charged in the case of paying off a porn star that has to do with election law? Who else would be? So I mean, how does that, if it does, upend then what is an objective law enforcement agency, moving forward investigating corruption?
Well, this is why the pardon was one of the worst moments of Joe Biden's political career, because look, I get it. Carefully, if the speed limit is 55 and you carefully drive 68, you're not as bad as the person who drunkenly drives 90, obviously. But it's not a defense to say, okay, you've arrested both the person drunkenly driving 90 and the person carefully driving 68 in the 55-mile-an-hour zone. I should get off. Obviously, drunkenly driving 90 is worse than carefully driving 68, but you did break the rules. And in Hunter Biden's case, I think there's a special duty of people in the first family to behave responsibly. And yeah, Hunter Biden was probably punished more severely than the typical person would have been. On the other hand, the typical person wouldn't have had the dishonorable opportunities of which Hunter Biden availed himself. I don't want to make a big issue out of Hunter Biden. I think more of that has been made. But it is a reminder that that prosecution was a powerful teaching moment to the American people about their public institutions. And the pardon was unfortunately also a teachable moment of the wrong kind.
Oh, speaking of Kash Patel and Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense nominee for President-elect Trump, he ran as someone who would be a disruptor, who would get rid of the Washington insiders. He had disdain for academics during the course of his run. So, how would he thread the needle for his nominees for these positions? Given that most of the people with experience have some degree of insider status in Washington or academic background or some sort of expertise, which put them in the crosshairs of the rhetoric of Trump throughout his campaign. How would he sort of make good on how he talked about people in those classes and still nominate competent people to the positions?
So I divide the Trump nominees that we know about so far into four broad categories. The first category are the more or less normal nominees. They may be stars, they may be subpar, but Marco Rubio, it is not crazy that an important senator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee would be promoted to Secretary of State. Maybe he won't be one of America's greatest secretaries of state. Maybe he's not a person of impressive character, but it's not crazy that he's got the job. In the same way, Michael Waltz, the National Security Advisor nominee, again, a perfectly decorated combat veteran, an intelligent member of the House, again, maybe over promoted, but not a crazy choice. And there are many, many other such people. The Secretary of the Treasury, there are many designate, there are many others. Okay, more or less normal. Some of you maybe a little subpar, maybe not as impressive as some of your counterparts in other administrations, but nobody has reasonable complaints. There may be some doubts, but no complaints. Category one. Category two are the damaged souls. These are people like Hegseth. These are people like Matt Gaetz. That they are people, there's something wrong with them. They are abusers of women. They have alcohol problems. They have other kinds of personality defects. They are people who would normally, the whole purpose of the kind of mesh screen of Washington life is to screen out such people because even if they're not unintelligent, Hegseth is not a stupid man. They just don't have the character for positions of high public responsibility. And so there are a lot of people in that category. On the other hand, those people are not necessarily unpatriotic, and they're not always in public service for the wrong reasons. They're just the wrong personality type. And as I say, many of them can be quite intelligent, and many of them have idealism and the right reasons, but they're just damaged, and they're the kind of people you normally screen out. Category two: one, normal; two, the damaged souls. Category three are the people who are the two categories of people who are in government for the wrong reasons. Category three are the people who are there to get rich or to serve somebody who already is rich. Vivek Ramaswamy, Elon Musk. These are people with no concept of public service who are there to benefit themselves and their investors, or I won't go through all the names. Some of them are quite obscure, but at the agencies, there are people who are there because some rich and powerful person wanted them there, and they're there to serve not the American people, but some patron. That's category three. The people who are there to get rich or to serve somebody who already is rich. And then category four are the people who are outright dangerous, either because, as with Tulsi Gabbard, who's been appointed or named to head the whole national security intelligence system because they're compromised by some foreign power, or like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., because they're just a crazy person with deranged ideas about public health that will make people sick, or other similar kind of people. They're just people who should be no. And I put Kash Patel. Kash Patel is a little bit of the category two, the damaged personality, but he's mostly a category four, someone who should be nowhere near power. Who are dangerous to the American constitutional system, the public health, the national security of the United States. So these are the four groups: normies,
How,
normies, damaged souls, people in it for the money or to serve somebody with money, and the dangerous.
so how do you see the Senate responding to each of those four categories to the nominees that are in those groups as you define them?
Most of that struggle will be invisible. That is, I think everyone who gets to a Senate vote will probably pass. But many of these nominations will fall apart before there's a Senate vote because of tacit, unspoken vetoes by the Senate. That's what happened to Matt Gaetz. Um, he never got a vote. The Senate just said, "Don't do this to us," and his nomination fell apart, and he withdrew. I imagine something like that is going to happen with Kash Patel. The Senate can only do that so many times, but they've done it in the past. In the first Trump term, the Senate, a Republican Senate, nixed without a vote two Trump nominees to the Federal Reserve. One because he was just a weirdo, one because he was just utterly unqualified, and the other was not unqualified but had strange ideas. And the Senate nixed them and got rid of both of them without a vote. Um, if they get to the voting process, I think the senators will not want to defy the president. But nominations fall apart, and they have a long period of time to do so.
Well, in looking at Hegseth and the continued support of the president-elect, do you think he is likely to end up with a vote and being confirmed?
Hegseth may make it through because, again, he's in the category two, the damaged soul. Uh, he, so here's the precedent for Hegseth. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush nominated a man named John Tower to be Secretary of Defense. Tower had been a two-term head of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He was a really serious defense intellectual. He was very much admired, had a lot of weight in Washington on defense matters, but he had a drinking problem. And when he was drunk, he became a sex pest. He bothered women. And in 1989, it wasn't as certain as it is today that those things were incompatible with government service. You know, the United States won World War II with the aid of a lot of people who drank too much. Um, but it came into public light and the nomination fell apart and Tower was forced to withdraw. If Hegseth can convince the senators that he no longer drinks, that his sexual conduct was, while unattractive, not at least never actually violent and not abusive. Then, and he can force a vote, he may make it through because they'll say, you know what, he doesn't seem like a bad person. He doesn't seem unpatriotic. He doesn't seem compromised by a foreign power. He's just kind of a mess, and uh, and we'll let it go. One more thing to say about that. A lot of the damage that a nominee can do depends on the strength of the bureaucracy. So the uniformed military does not mind it when the Secretary of Defense is weak, because the uniformed military then gets to run itself. That a non-knowledgeable, lazy, somewhat drunk civilian is not necessarily a disaster from the Pentagon point of view, because then they don't have to listen to that person anymore. And the Pentagon is a robust enough institution that it can probably work its way around a weak or inept or undercompetent Secretary of Defense. Where the damage really comes is when you get a small bureaucracy like the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where an improper person like Tulsi Gabbard can really do a lot of damage, and there are not a lot of checks because the office is small, or comparatively small.
What's an example of damage that you could foresee Tulsi Gabbard in that position
Oh my
bringing
gosh.
to that office?
Well, here's a real world example. In his early months as president, Donald Trump invited the Russian ambassador and the Russian foreign minister to visit him at the Oval Office. And then, because he loves the Russians and because he's a big mouth and because he has no judgment, he began blabbing about all the fantastic secrets he knew. And one of the secrets he blabbed, we still don't know 100% of the detail of what happened, but the Israelis had deeply penetrated ISIS in some way, either a technical means or had a human source. But Trump told the Russian foreign minister and the Russian ambassador about the nature of the Israeli penetration of the upper reaches of ISIS, just being a blowhard big mouth. Now, Tulsi Gabbard is a little bit worse than a blowhard big mouth. She could blab secrets, and she could blab, she has a lot of loyalties about which there's a question mark. She could betray secrets, and that's pretty serious. You know, I, people on this podcast are probably old enough to remember the name of Alger Hiss. Why was that such a big story? So Alger Hiss had been a mid-level employee in the Department of Agriculture during the Depression. He had been a believing communist, and he had betrayed some very unimportant secrets of the United States to a Soviet spy operation in the 1930s. Then he stopped doing it during the war. Something happened, whether he changed his mind or whether he got more cautious, but he didn't, after a certain point, he stopped betraying any more secrets. And the secrets he betrayed were not that important. So why did a dozen years later this become such an explosive matter? And the answer is, well, Hiss was a very capable person. He was rising through the ranks. He was becoming, from a mid-level employee at the Department of Agriculture, a fairly high-level employee at the Department of State. And the idea that a person of suspect loyalties would hold these positions and could then betray the interest, now that ripped the country apart. Uh, Now, we're not talking about a fairly high level. We're talking about the highest level of national secrets. Person who will have access to almost every secret that the president himself has access to. And this person was an apologist for the Assad regime, a defender of the Putin's Russia. Really? Really? I think we owe, if that's okay, then we owe a big apology to Alger Hiss.
What are the likelihood that the Senate would confirm Gabbard and RFK Jr. at HHS?
I think the Gabbard nomination probably does fall apart because it is so shocking. It's so dangerous. And I think the events in Syria have sort of put an unwelcome spotlight on her. I think with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., it may be more complicated. There may be a feeling among senators that uh, the HHS is such like a federal bureaucracy. It's like so many components, most of them quite independent. They may feel that a person as crazy as him can probably not penetrate deeply into the HHS. I mean, I don't agree with this. I would vote against him, obviously. Um, but they can't reject everybody, unfortunately. And if he doesn't fall apart on his own and it comes to a vote, and he may pick up a Democratic vote or two, I'm sorry to say.
Interesting. Just because
There are a lot of,
uh,
look, there are a lot of, look, healthcare crack pottery used to be a liberal thing. That a decade ago or 15 years ago, the center of anti-vax filling in the United States was Marin County. I mean, it was a left-wing lunatic cause, not a right-wing lunatic cause. And now, and it's now become truly bipartisan to be a healthcare crackpot. And so it appeals to the far right as well as the far left. But as we saw with some of the supportive messages from, for example, Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, there are people on the far left who think that the answer to smoke enough pot and you won't get cancer.
I want to invite our viewers to ask questions. You can do so in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And if you're comfortable doing it, please include your first name and your location. It's nice to share with other viewers where you're watching the program from across the country or around the world. You mentioned Syria. Let's talk about the rapid fall of the Assad regime within 10 to 11 days. Remarkable offensive that certainly most people did not see coming. So, what do you anticipate is going to be the reaction of the incoming president to this further level of complexity in the Middle East?
Well, I am very far from a regional expert, so I want to really stay away from anything I don't know a lot about. And so I'm not going to make any comments about the internal operations of Syrian politics. That's just not my department. But it does seem, from an American point of view, a domestic American point of view, that the incoming president has been presented with a remarkably plastic moment where the Middle East could very suddenly be very different, for good or for ill, in 6 months' time from what it has been for a long time. The remarkable successes of the Israeli military against Hezbollah and against Hamas as well have opened up a lot of possibilities. And I'm not an admirer of the president, of the current next president anyway, but I will say he's got one thing going from a foreign policy, which he is not bound by. This is, I think, it's also bad. He doesn't have a lot of respect for conventional advice. So sometimes that leads him to good decisions, like everyone says you can't kill Qasem Soleimani, and he said, I don't see why not. I don't understand the arguments against it. Let's do it and see what happens. The United States did it, and it was a big success. And all the negative consequences that the people who worried about killing Qasem Soleimani, there had been opportunities to do it before, worried about, they didn't materialize, and his call was right. But if Syria is to be stabilized, my assessment, not of Syria, but of just the way international relations work, is you need a big coalition. You need partners. And a presidency that rejects the idea of foreign policy partnership is going to have a hard time making a success of the project of stabilizing Syria.
Let's talk about Israel. You're a big supporter of Israel, and Donald Trump ran as someone who would be even more supportive of the country than Joe Biden has been during the course of his administration. What form do you think that is likely to take if, in fact, he follows through with it?
Well, I want to take a moment to salute President Biden, as I said some negative things about the pardon. President Biden went farther in the support of Israel during a time of conflict than any American president ever has before. And I think people don't remember how distant the military relationship between the United States and the Israel was until the 1990s. That makes it hard for them to appreciate the magnitude of what Joe Biden did, shipping so much weaponry so rapidly, such unqualified support, visiting twice in state of war. Ronald Reagan, as president, never visited Israel at all. He's remembered as a great friend of Israel. He never went. And not because he was afraid to travel or because his health didn't permit it. It just he was worried about the repercussions in the region if he made that visit. Biden went twice, and then twice during a shooting war. Now, there's some Biden always had a tendency to find out the range of possible options and then go right down the middle, do exactly half of what was possible. And that's a little bit what he did with his support of Israel. He went very far, but not maybe as far as possible, maybe not as far as necessary. Um, Donald Trump is going to give Israel, it looks like, a lot more room, leeway to make their own decisions. If Israel has a plan, they'll have more room to execute the plan. But if they don't have a plan, it's going to be a little bit embarrassing for everybody.
Did you have concerns about with the president-elect giving so much latitude to Netanyahu that means even more Israeli settlement building in the West Bank, more delays in terms of attempting to rebuild Gaza and find some stability there? Do you have concerns that this is going to serve the needs of Netanyahu, but not of Israelis themselves?
Um, Hamas went up to a very fragile vase, took a baseball bat, and smashed it into a million pieces. And people now ask, how is this thing going to be put back together again? And I think one of the things you have to answer is, when you do that kind of damage, it's very hard to put it back together. How do you rebuild Gaza? I don't know. I don't know. Probably that's something that the ruling authorities of Gaza should have thought about a little bit in advance. But the idea that you go through a trauma like October 7th, that the people who have been ruling Gaza since 2005 could do such a thing, and then say, okay, now what we need is a big international effort to rebuild it the way it was, and we need the borders to reopen again so people can resume commuting to jobs in Israel. It's not going back. So I don't know what's happening. Um, Look, Hamas lost its war. Its goals, its affirmative goals, have been completely defeated. But its negative goal of wrecking for a long time to come any cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians, that goal's been achieved. On that score, they won. Now, I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't have some formula because sometimes, as Bill Clinton said in his recent interview, when people destroy a once in a lifetime opportunity, the whole point to a once in a lifetime opportunity is if you say no, it doesn't come back. If you smash trust, it doesn't come back. So I don't know what the future of Gaza is going to be. As I say, they should have thought of that in advance.
What uh, what do you see as the likely stance that President-elect Trump is going to take when it comes to Iran, given that Iran seems to have just suffered setback after setback with Hamas, with what's happened in Syria? Just Iran has gone through arguably the biggest setbacks it's had in decades. So how does Trump now either capitalize on that or deal with that generally?
Well, there's a real opportunity. I think one of the other difficulties that Iran is going to have is I'm guessing the second Trump presidency is going to see a slowdown in global economic activity. Um, Trump's going to lead the way with his tariffs and his mass deportations. Those are both going to be constricting things on the U.S. economy. So I think the outlook for the U.S. economy under Trump is less robust than it was in the immediate post-COVID aftermath. That's just my opinion. What do I know? But that's my assessment. And and interest rates, although they're coming down, remain higher than they've been for a long time. Plus, there's going to be a lot of oil production, and that's going to drive down the price of oil. So, if I'm so basically, the outlook for Iran is probably less global demand over the next 3 years or 4 years than there has been over the past 3 or 4 years. Much more global supply of oil than there has been over the past 3 or 4 years. And that looks to be a pretty grim outlook to a country that doesn't produce anything other than oil that anybody in the world wants. And meanwhile, their terror empire has been damaged very badly by Israeli military action. The Hezbollah's inventories of weapons have been destroyed. Syria's inventories of weapons have been destroyed. So they're vulnerable to economic pressure. Always, I mean, as I say, Trump tried to overthrow an election. He tried to seize power by violence. There isn't a lot good to say about him. But in foreign policy, the great negative is he doesn't believe in partnership. He doesn't believe in allies. He believes that America barks, other people obey. But the one good thing in foreign policy about him is he is not deferential to orthodoxies that don't meet the test. As with the Qasem Soleimani killing, as with the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, Trump does have an ability to say, why don't we do this? And you get a very complicated explanation. And he'll say, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Let's just do it and see what happens. And you do it and see what happens. And the results in the Israel Middle East context have so far been reasonably positive.
We talk about international issues, tariffs, of course, going to be front and center. He already floated the idea of enormous tariffs on Canada and Mexico, as well as China. But the question is what the impact is going to be on other trading partners of the U.S. as well. And based on what he did during his first term and his practices, do you think it's almost all negotiating position on his part? Or do you think we're really going to see some of these huge tariffs, and what would the consequences be for the country in your view?
Donald Trump began running for president in 1987. He really thought he had a chance at the Republican nomination in 1988. And the way he announced his candidacy was by taking up full-page ads in the New York Times and other newspapers calling for trade wars, in those days with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Um, he's been on every side of abortion. He's been on every side of the immigration issue. But through his career, the one thing he has always believed in is tariffs. Because the one thing about the world Donald Trump believes is there's no such thing as a win-win deal. The only way I know I win is if you lose. If you walk away from the table and are happy with your deal, it must have been a bad deal for me. So the whole premise of a free market economy, the whole premise of international trade, he rejects. There's no such thing as mutual benefit in the Donald Trump world. So he's always believed in tariffs. Now, he doesn't understand how they work. And he doesn't think very hard about how they work. For example, one of the things he keeps saying is when the United States imposes a tariff, that's not paid by American consumers, it's paid by the foreigners. Now that's wrong. But let's say he's right. Let's say he's right. Let's say, okay, you're right. The American tariff is paid by the foreigners. When the foreigners impose a retaliatory tariff on the Americans, who pays that? Well, didn't think of that. Didn't think of that. I guess under his theory, the retaliatory tariff must be paid by the Americans. And you know what? The Chinese economy is now not as big as the American economy, but it's important. One of the big talking points of Trump and especially his running mate, J.D. Vance, during the 24 campaign was that the United States under Biden had become a food importing nation. And that was true. He was right. The United States has almost always run a big surplus in trade in food. And in the 2020s, that stopped. Why? Well, part of the answer is the dollar was strong, and so Americans were able to buy more mangoes and bananas, pineapples, and other things the United States tends to import. So food imports went up a little. But the main thing that happened was food exports cratered. Um, the United States is the largest crop in the United States is soybeans. Um, corn and soybeans are the two most important crops. Corn tends to be turned into ethanol, so it is not a huge export market for corn. And whatever you think about ethanol, it's consumed here at home. But soybeans were exported until 2017, when the Chinese, to punish the United States for Trump's tariffs, switched to Brazil as their primary. And you can look at if you look at a chart of soybean exports, both Brazil and the United States grow in tandem from 2000 to 2017, and then the Brazilian line keeps going up and the American line goes down, and that's why there's a food deficit because of Trump's own actions. And the United States is integrated into global supply chains. You can't just punish foreigners in trade and think there won't be an effect on Americans. People will say about tariffs that they're inflationary. Now, that's not exactly right because inflation is a monetary phenomenon. In an inflation, prices, what we see, like when you look at at the stars and they seem to be moving around the Earth, they're not. The Earth is moving. When you have a tariff, prices go up. It looks like I mean it looks like the prices are going up. It looks like the prices are moving, but in fact the money's it's the money that is moving. Your money is becoming less valuable, and the prices therefore go up. But at the supermarket, none of this matters. Things are going to be more expensive, not inflationary expensive, real expensive. And that's going to be a negative effect on the whole U.S. economy. Mexico is now America's largest trading partner. Canada and China vie for number two. Trump wants to put big tariffs on all of them. And when people try to drive home the point about what tariffs do, they usually use homely examples like Mexican tomatoes and Mexican avocados, because you can imagine you go to the store, the avocado is the same from beginning to end. But the real harm of these tariffs is they change the way supply chains work. Almost every product is both a product and an input into another product. So Mexico produces a lot of industrial glass, and you put a tariff on that, you raise the price of glass. But that glass turns into windows. And even if those windows are made in the United States, you've raised the price of the window. Those windows are turned into buildings. You've raised the price of the building. Those buildings house activities. You've raised the price of the activity. So why is your conference more expensive? Why do you have to pay more for your hotel room? It's because of the tariff on glass.
David, let's take some viewer questions. Again, you can put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the page. Is it outside the realm of reality to think that confirmation hearings actually matter? Is it unrealistic to think there are GOP senators who would, in the open hearings and vote against any of Trump's nominees?
Yeah. If Aaron Sorkin were running the universe, yes. I think in actual Washington, these things happen in private. Senators don't like to take these big public positions. It's more that a position slowly crumbles, everyone becomes aware that the nominee doesn't have the votes, and the nominee then decides to spend more time with his or her family.
Several of our viewers have asked, do you believe American politics will in our lifetimes return to, quote, normal?
Um, I don't think once done, things don't get undone. Um, there's a work of repair. You can repair things. Things are not irreparable, but things don't go back to the way they were before. I mean, I used to do, I don't do it anymore, but in the olden days, my earlier career, and I would do more things. I would do inauguration morning TV. And the way it would work is the inauguration takes place, of course, at noon. The TV coverage would take place at 9, and there's nothing to do except sit on a frozen bleacher and talk about trivia. And so one of the things that people would talk about to fill airtime was America's long tradition of the peaceful transfer of power. And even back then, this always struck me as kind of like windy because, Denmark and Great Britain, they also have traditions of the peaceful transfer of power. But anyway, it was a thing to say. So the American tradition of the peaceful transfer of power is now less old than those of Moldova and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, both of which had peaceful transfers of power in 2019. In 2024, this will be America's first peaceful transition of power since the violent transition of power in 2021, and that's never going to get undone. The fact that the United States has now a shorter history of peaceful transfers of power than Moldova and the Democratic Republic of Congo, that's not going to change. That's just history. That's just fact. Um, uh, Trump's approach to the FBI director, that's probably going to endure. I mean, he's changed many things. So we can build some new and better traditions. But Trump also is very good at exploiting places in American life where there was no rule against something. There was just a practice of not doing it. There's no law that says the president can't operate a business, can't have a cookie factory in front of the White House and ask every visitor, did you buy my cookie? It's just precedents didn't do it until Donald Trump. And he would say, did you stay in my hotel? And you would have one kind of meeting if you had stayed in his hotel, and a worse kind of meeting if you hadn't. Now, maybe we can write the law to stop that. But the idea that the president would be too honorable, that you need such a law, that's over. We will either future presidents will have businesses or there will be a law.
What about the polarization that we have in the country? Because as you wrote about in your last book, there's this cultural rebellion that's taking place. And is there anything that you see that could potentially bring Americans together to find more commonality when you have such vast cultural differences? And one of this embodied in the large numbers of young men who supported Trump in this past election, who feel very alienated from the direction in which American culture has gone in recent years.
Well, we have one answer to that in American history. We have seen depolarization happen. So in the 20, 40 years after the Civil War, the United States had a very polarized polity in the 1880s, 1890s. As whether you, like a political scientist, measure it in terms of the way the parties, how seldom the parties overlapped in their votes in Congress. If you look at the level of political violence in the country, if you looked at we don't have opinion survey, but if you look at the rhetoric of the times, the 1880s and 1890s were very, very polarized period. And then the United States went through a series of experiences, of which the most important were the Great Depression and the Second World War. And you saw a radical reduction in the politics of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. They were much less polarized. And while the political system in particular was a tool of depolarization. Americans in the 50s and 60s disagreed about a lot. Race is one obvious example. But the political system was always a force for unification and de-escalation in those days. Now we're back to the 1880s in the way the society is polarized, and this time the political system is an accelerant. Now, could we go? Will this cycle turn? Maybe. I don't know. That could happen. Is there something that people of goodwill can self-consciously do to make it turn? I think no. I think that these things are driven by the reason we depolarized was the United States faced new and more serious international dangers. The United States had experiences of the tremendous success of recovery from the Great Depression, and the combination of success at home and danger abroad tended to coalesce American leadership. But no one could have planned that or made it happen on purpose. And I don't know that we can plan it or make it happen on purpose now.
My memory is that early on you were a supporter. Was it No Labels, the sort of the more moderate group early on of that? And do you see any role for some sort of an organization like that might have a degree of fiscal conservatism, more socially liberal on issues, generally more moderate?
So No Labels got going after the Tea Party elections, and I was sort of interested in that because a lot of the polarization seemed to be in the 2010s very elite driven. That is that there were we'd had the terrible trauma of the Great Recession. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future of people's healthcare coverage with so many out of work. And then a certain number of highly ideological political groups then you took those feelings, professionalized them, and turned them into the tea. There are two Tea Parties. The original one in 2010, which was pretty spontaneous, but also pretty crazy. And then there was the Tea Party of 2011, 2012, which was more professional, less crazy, but much more elite driven. And I thought, so long as this was artificial, was elite driven, you could have better elites. But that's pre-Trump. I mean, I think we've got now a really deep change in the way the political, as I said, I don't think people of goodwill can sit around a table and fix this. It's going to be fixed in the way the polarization of the 80s turned into the depolarization of the 50s by historical events that we can't control, predict, or make happen.
Marshall wrote that David French in today's New York Times indicated that Chris Wray's resignation would prevent Patel from becoming FBI director because Patel hasn't been in a similar position in the past year. Can you comment on that? I didn't read the piece, so.
He was talking about a recess appointment. So there's some technical rules about how you become eligible for a recess appointment without a Senate vote. And so if you've been in a comparable, so if you've been basically, if you've been Assistant Secretary of Agriculture and the president wants to make you Assistant Secretary of the Interior, you can slide sideways when the Senate's not in, or when the House is not in session. The Senate's not in session. You can slide sideways to a comparable position without a Senate vote and serve for a certain number of months. So that's what he's talking about there. That yes, it prevents a Kash Patel recess appointment, but it doesn't prevent Trump from appointing Kash Patel and then trying to force him through the Senate.
Through the conventional process. Lynn says, do you really believe the FBI has been above politics? Didn't the Biden administration and the failed Supreme Court nominee as Attorney General use the FBI to investigate many associates of Trump from the first administration?
So when I was in the Bush White House, I wrote speeches. One of the things we were told is if you ever have the inkling to call anybody at the FBI or the Department of Justice, you walk over to the White House counsel and you tell the counsel what you want to talk about, and the counsel places the call for you. And if you think about placing that call yourself, you're fired and maybe prosecuted. So that was just the norm. So the reason so many people in the Trump orbit got prosecuted is because Trump surrounded himself with criminals. Like you don't get an extra degree of immunity from prosecution because you work for the president if you also commit crimes. But the idea that they were directed by Merrick Garland or others is just it's just a fantasy. It's just a fantasy. It's just not true. It doesn't work that way. And as I said, you do not. People in the White House did not talk to the FBI director. I don't think Bob Mueller served W. Bush and Obama. I don't believe that Mueller ever had a one-on-one meeting with Bush after the day, except for the day that Bush appointed him. I don't think he ever had a one-on-one meeting with Bush again. I don't believe he ever had a one-on-one meeting with Obama. FBI directors. So one of the things Trump has done is, in order to, because he's so guilty and surrounded by such guilty people, he tries to contaminate Americans' understanding of the whole system, how the way the system works. Presidents don't talk to FBI directors; they're not supposed to. And FBI directors don't talk to presidents, and people in the White House don't talk to the prosecutors, and that's how it normally works. Now, I don't want to say it's 100% accuracy because obviously people break rules, and sometimes they get away with it, often they don't. But Trump was surrounded by guilty people who did all kinds of shady stuff. So it's not, and then he tried to overthrow an election by violence. So yeah, it's not surprising that that would trigger a lot of prosecutions. And then he stole a bunch of government documents on his way out of the building. And one of them was the war plan for fighting Iran, which he waved under the nose of a shady Australian businessman in the same way that he boasted to the Russians about how Israel had penetrated ISIS. So like, it can't be that you say, well, the proof that he was persecuted was that he was investigated without regard to what did he do and what did the people around him do.
We have a number of viewers who've asked, do you think that President Biden should pardon Senator Schiff and Liz
No,
Cheney and
no,
others who
absolutely not.
were? Okay.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. He shouldn't have pardoned his son, for starters. But Now, I think one of the reasons that the Biden people are tempted to do these other preemptive pardons is it makes the Hunter Biden pardon look less bad. But it creates a rationalization. Schiff did nothing wrong. Acceptance of a pardon in American law is always understood, is always applied, consciousness of guilt. I think people have to, the Schiffs, the Cheneys, who are not just have done nothing wrong, they're heroes. The Dr. Fauci's, if I were Dr. Fauci, I would I'd crumple it up. I'd throw the person out of the mouth. I wouldn't talk to them. You want to prosecute me? You prosecute me. You take me in front of a jury. And Congress, if I remember Congress, maybe then can later vote to reimburse them for what they spent. But these are innocent people or heroes in the case of Cheney and Fauci. Um, and no pardon. They've done nothing wrong. Pardons are
Merlin,
for people who admit what they've done wrong.
Merlin asks, is Trump likely to purge the military of senior officers he deems insufficiently loyal to him? And what would be the results if he did that?
He's really going to try. That's why does Trump want? Why does Trump accept a perfectly professional person at Treasury and have a buffoon? Not a buffoon. That's too hard because except it was a person who once had capabilities, but this broken man, Pete Hegseth. Why does he want him for Secretary of Defense? Because he's thinking about those kinds of issues. Now it's difficult. It's more difficult to do than you might think because you can't just, unlike putting somebody from Fox News on at FBI, you can't just appoint some major somewhere to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staffs. The military has its own hierarchy, its own rules, and so you have to work within the military system. That you move the 1 stars to the 2 star, the 2 star to the 3 star, the 3 star to the 4 star, and they have a lot of internal rules about that. And it would be kind of an uproar to try to work around it. But I think he's got something like that in mind, um, and it's something really to worry about.
Phyllis asks if all the assertions you make about Tulsi Gabbard are true, how did she get a top security clearance?
When did she have a top security clearance?
I don't know. Yeah.
She's a
Well,
member of the
what's
House.
required for a position like this, in addition to a president's nomination, is there any security clearance required?
She was a member of the House of Representatives, and then she was an Army Reserve officer with a rank of I think major or captain. So she didn't have a high security clearance. Um, if she becomes director of national, the president has total control. The whole security system is an artifact of presidential power, and presidents can classify. The president could go on TV and read the nuclear war plan for fighting China aloud, and then it would be public information. Presidents have totally plenitentiary power to declassify, and they establish rules for guidance because they don't want to have to make every one of these thousands or tens of thousands of classification decisions themselves. But let me put it this way: if you had Tulsi Gabbard's career as a mid-level army officer and a member of the House of Representatives, and you went to Syria on a trip paid for by who knows who, and said all those nice things about the Syrian government, and then defended you worked as a defense contractor in Northern Virginia, you would not have a security clearance.
Roger asks, what are the chances after a couple of years that there will be buyer's remorse about Trump and the majorities in the House and Senate might flip?
He's got a majority of one in the House right now. And one of the things, it's a reminder of kind of the strangeness of the way Trump operates. So the outcome of the election was when all was finally counted and California brought in its polls, however the carrier pigeon or whatever you used to make it take so long. The
We're
final
counting every vote.
with your toes, um, 220 to 215. And then he appointed 3 members of the Republican majority to positions in his administration where they had Matt Gaetz resigned a seat, others will. So it's now a majority of 217 to 215. And of course, in the House, ties are no's, not in the Senate. There's no tiebreaker in the House. So he's got a 1 vote majority in the House. Now, I think those 3 come from pretty safe Republican seats, and probably by summer, it'll be 220 to 215 again. But people resign all the time. People die. Uh, and it's risky. And of course, yeah, we've seen flips. We've seen dramatic flips in 2014, 2018. We didn't see a dramatic flip in 2020, but 2022, the Democrats beat every expectation. You've had a lot of uncanny off-year elections since 2014, and 2026 could well be one of them.
Well, and we hear 2026 is, in terms of the districts that are up, could be more favorable to Democrats than Republicans. Is that something you've looked at very closely?
I have not looked at it closely, but there's something else that does seem to be happening, um, which is we're on a long cycle of a couple of mega trends in American voting. And some of them are pretty positive, which is voting is becoming deracialized. And Trump was a beneficiary, both a driver of that and a beneficiary. This idea of a coalition of color against a coalition of white Americans, that's really not happening in the 21st century. Um, and we've also seen that non-college voters, especially men, are moving into the Republican coalition regardless of race. And college voters, regardless of race, are moving to the Democratic coalition. Uh, in the off years, college voters are much more likely to show up than non-college voters. And so, whereas once upon a time, if you made it a little difficult for people to vote, you helped Republicans and hurt Democrats. Today, it may have the opposite effect. That's what happened in 2022, and then again with the even further down ballot races in 2023. That Democrats are stronger among high propensity voters. Republicans are stronger among low propensity voters. So in off years, Democrats tend to do better than you might have thought in years past. That's the story of 2022.
Final audience question is from Philip. Can the Trump administration actually fire civil servants? It seems like that would be illegal.
It would be illegal. And I mean, you can change the law, but as I say, one vote majority of the House of Representatives. I want to say something about the Project 2025 thing, which is, on the one hand, Project 2025, very extreme, very provocative. On the other hand, I don't think Project 2025 was exactly the problem because the people who put it together, as I say, extreme, but smart, knowledgeable, and in politics for reasons of idealism, in a way that they were people who are in politics for the right reason. You may not like what they're doing, but you can respect the reasons they do it. This is not like the rest of the Trump coalition, which is made up of these damaged spiritual people or people in politics to get rich or people who are actively dangerous. So yeah, they are going to try to make the civil service more at the whim of the president. I think they will probably fail, but that's not a reprehensible idea. You may agree with it or not. The idea that the president should have more authority over the civil service, past presidents did, and America didn't fall apart. I don't think it's going to happen, and I think different parts of the civil service um, are different. I mean, we think it, like, for example, part of the civil service where the president has absolute discretion are with U.S. attorneys. The president picks them for partisan reasons. At the end of a president, they all go. Like that you think that's like the worst place to be political. And yet, for reasons of tradition, it's a place where everyone accepts. Yeah, you can pick a political ally to be the prosecutor for the Southern District of New York. You can fire the president can fire them at any time. That don't think that because there's been one election that went in a way that you find dispiriting or frightening, that you're somehow absolved of your duties as a citizen. Never, ever, ever give up. Um, and I would say these are scary and difficult times. Scary and difficult times are times when your country needs you. You should be grateful to be alive at a time when your country needs you. Keep reading, keep being informed. Be informed not just about national affairs, but about local affairs. That's more and more difficult to do um, for because of trends in the media industry. You're going to have to make a little bit more effort to be on top of what's happening in your town or state, but it's worth it. Be a good citizen. You have never been more needed to be a good citizen than now.
Thank you so much, David. And thanks to our viewers for the always excellent questions they ask. We really appreciate you being with us this evening.
Bye bye.
Thank you. In just a few days, I'll be back with two former leaders, one Israeli, one Palestinian. Former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, returns to America to Crossroads. Also with us, former Foreign Minister of the Palestinian Authority, Nasser al-Kidwa. That's this coming Sunday, 10 a.m. Pacific time, 10 in the morning Pacific time, this coming Sunday. And as always, we thank you for your tax-deductible contribution to Jews United for Democracy and Justice, which puts on these weekly and sometimes like over the next week, twice weekly programs to talk about these very, very important issues. You can go to Jews United for democracy.org. That's Jews United for Democracy.org to make your contribution to assure the continuation of this free series. Thank you so much for being with us, and from all of us at America at Crossroads, good evening.